Well, thanks so much for that kind introduction and for inviting me here. It will be a great experience, I'm sure, and many interesting discussions. So I'm going to talk about latent state dynamical system modeling of neural and behavioral data. And I believe you've already heard about these types of models previously in the previous days. So as you know, a latent state dynamical system model aims to describe the temporal structure or dynamics in neural activity in terms of a set of latent brain states that themselves have temporal structure. So for example, here I'm showing you a linear dynamical system model. So you can see that neural activity is a function of the latent state, and the latent state itself has temporal dynamics specified by this recursive equation. So there are various ways to fit this linear dynamical system models, expectation maximization that you've heard about. There are also subspace-based methods in control theory that you can use to fit these. So you've already heard about these. So what I'm going to do today is to show you how we can build on this linear dynamical system model for neural data to add additional capabilities one by one. So first, I'm going to talk about how we can also incorporate behavior measurements when we are training these dynamical system models. Then I'm going to talk about inputs, whether it's neurostimulation input or sensory input, and how we can incorporate that effect and why that is important to do. Then I'm going to talk about how we can go from these interpretable linear dynamical system models towards nonlinear dynamical models of neural behavioral data, but in a manner that still affords some level of interpretability. We're going to also talk about using multimodal neural activity patterns that we can record from multiple spatial temporal scale and how we can have essentially extension to multi-scale dynamical modeling. And finally, I'll talk about geometry. Can we take advantage of geometric insight and take structure of these manifolds that neural dynamics evolve over into account when building these dynamical system models? I'm also going to talk about application of these dynamical system models. Of course, these already have application in terms of offline studies of neural data sets. But what about real-time systems? So how can we use these models to develop model-based closed-loop decoding and control systems to both causally validate our models in neuroscience and develop brain-machine interfaces and neurotechnologies? Okay? So that's kind of the plan. Let's get started. So first, what about behavior? So why is it important to add behavior into the mix? Now, in a lot of investigations, what we are really interested in is to understand those neural dynamics that underlie specific behavior, let's say arm movements. Now, in these cases, if we can develop joint latent state dynamical systems of neural activity and behavior, that may allow us to identify this link and understand it better, and also allow us to decode behavior and modulate it better. So that's the motivation, and that's why in recent years we've been working towards this joint neural behavioral dynamical modeling. So let's see why this is important. So this is the mathematics we started from for a latent state dynamical model of neural data. Now let's add behavior measurements. So the problem is that not all of the latent states that give rise to your neural activity are necessarily related to the behavior that you're measuring. So if we think about the states of this overall neural behavioral signal set, there's those that are shared between neural activity and behavior. I'm showing them with green. But there are also disjoint states. For example, the red states that are just in neural data and the blue states that are just in behavior. So we can decompose the states into these three elements, write the neural activity in terms of the green and the red state, write behavior in terms of the green and the blue states. Now, let's see why it's important to train a dynamical model jointly. So what do our current training methods do? We have neural dynamical models that are trained unsupervised with respect to behavior. So the issue is that these models may actually extract those red states that, while of course exist in neural recordings, may not be behaviorally relevant and can potentially confound the extraction of the green states that we are actually interested in. There's also the traditional representational modeling paradigms that kind of do the opposite. They build a dynamical model of behavior first, then downstream related to neural data. So what can happen is that these models can actually extract those blue states and, again, confound the green states. So with this motivation, we wanted to develop an algorithm that directly extracted and dissociated the green behaviorally relevant dynamics. And that algorithm is called PSID that we published back in 2020. So how does PSID work? We put these equations together. So we have all these elements of the state. And the state is now dissociated into the behaviorally relevant elements and the other elements. And this is a joint dynamical model of neural and behavioral data. So the new capability that PSID provides is that it allows you to dissociate those green parts from the rest of the states. And as I'll show you, this dissociation allows it to extract these behaviorally relevant dynamics much more accurately and with much lower state dimensions. Now, in the methods lecture, I'm going to go into the details and the derivation of the learning algorithm. But here, I'm going to just give you some level of intuition as to how this works. So the intuition here is that these green states would summarize everything we know about future behavior in terms of past neural signals. So what PSID does is it projects future behavior signals onto past neural signals. We show that doing this extracts the shared subspace between neural and behavioral signals, and we can fit the model parameters within that subspace. And I'll show you more details in the method lecture. OK, so once we fit this, the good thing is the extraction of latent state in a new data set has nothing to do with behavior. So essentially what you do, you take the first two lines and write the corresponding inference algorithm, which is just a simple, efficient, quick Kalman filter with parameters that are specified by PSID. You just operate on neural signal, you get your latent state, and then you can, from that, decode behavior. OK, so how does this algorithm work? We tested PSID on a naturalistic reach, grasp, and return movement data set. I'm going to show you this data set throughout, so I'm going to explain advanced. So this is a naturalistic data set. There are 3D objects presented to the animal. They're supposed to reach for it, grasp it, and then return to a resting position. We measure 27 joint angles and then neural activity from over 100 channels. So what we did was we said, OK, let's compare the decoding of movement by PSID with the unsupervised neural dynamical model. So this is trained unsupervised, then downstream fits a decoder from latent states to behavior. And you can see that at every latent state dimension, PSID decoded the movement more accurately than the neurodynamical model or NDM. And importantly, it achieved this better decoding using a much lower dimensional state, in this case, 5 times lower. And we also compared with unsupervised nonlinear neurodynamical models, such as sequential autoencoders, and the same benefits held. And the reason for this is, of course, this new capability for dissociating these green states so that you can first learn them more accurately, second, do so with much lower state dimensions. And I'll show you many more results in the methods lecture, and you'll get hands-on experience with PSID today. All right, so we added behavior. But what about input? In particular, in a lot of investigation, we might have some sort of external input into the neuronal population that we are studying. This could be neurostimulation, let's say optogenetics, could be sensory stimulation, for example, task instructions, visual task instructions, or it could be the activity of another brain region that we're actually measuring. So how can we take measured inputs into account, and why does that matter? So our first attempt in this direction was to model the effect of electrical stimulation on multi-regional brain activity. So in this case, the goal is to essentially build a model of this box, how inputs affect neural dynamics, so basically that box. Now, we wanted to do this, as I mentioned, for large-scale multi-regional networks measured with local field potentials. We wanted to do it in each individual and during time-varying electrical stimulation. So to solve this challenge, we resorted to the dynamical system model but added input into it. So it was a data-driven dynamical system modeling with input, and we showed that it could indeed predict these multi-regional dynamics. Now, how did the model work? So again, we start with this latent state dynamical model that you've seen before. But now we add the effect of input by hypothesizing that that effect is again reflected in that low-dimensional state variable, and then through that feeds into neural activity. Now, this is great, but the main question here is how do we train this model? To train this, you need to first obtain informative data set by stimulating the brain somehow, recording the response, and then collecting the data set. But how do we stimulate to get informative data? Now, in a theoretical paper back in 2018, we showed that not any stimulation pattern would work. We essentially need stimulation patterns that excite the brain persistently across all frequency ranges so that we can fit that transfer function accurately all across the frequency range. So we developed a novel electrical stimulation waveform that started from this biphasic pulses that are clinically safe, and then stochastically changed its frequency and amplitude according to essentially a coin flip. So this gave us a binary noise modulated electrical stimulation pattern that we showed is informative, persistently exciting, and clinically safe. So we started a collaboration with Bijan Pesaran's lab to actually test this in non-human primate experiments. We applied our binary noise to one brain region, then recorded LFB across multiple brain regions, fitted our models, and we found that indeed our models could predict in a feed-forward manner how neural activity changes in response to a time-varying stimulation, thus achieve this input-output modeling.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Before you go too much further, I have a question about your joint modeling.
Sure.
So when you're recording activity and measuring behavior at the same time, you don't know a priori which neural signals are causing the behavior and which neural signals are a response to the behavior.
Absolutely.
And so assuming that there is a certain amount of feedback into the system, either by efferent's copy or proprioceptive feedback from motion, is there a danger that when you use behavior to restrict the space of neural activity that you look at, you're going to be primarily identifying a state space which is strongly affected by motor feedback, and you may be selectively filtering out other behaviorally relevant signals that may be causal to behavior, but which are not directly affected by motor feedback?
That's a great question. So it is possible that it's not possible to ignore the rest, so because we have all of behavior, whether it's due to sensory feedback or not. But it is possible that that part dominates. That is a danger. And indeed, that's the motivation behind what I'm going to show you next, where we actually incorporate the effect of input, including sensory feedback, into the joint neural behavioral dynamical model. And I'll show you that indeed what you hypothesize can happen, that PSID could get confused by input modes, but once I add input to the mix, I can dissociate that effect. So that's kind of the next part of the time. Yeah, but that's a fantastic question. Primer for next section. Yes?
So a minor clarification. Throughout your talk, do you refer to neural data as the low-pass filtered version of like 1 to 300 hertz of the raw data?
Yeah. I'm talking very generally because I work with all of the modalities, and then I'll show you multimodal. But in general, I talk about spiking activity whenever I talk about it, unless I say otherwise. I'm talking about firing rates. When I talk about LFB, I'm talking about power bands, unless I tell you otherwise, which is raw LFB, but I'll specify that. But I'm talking very generally because I'll even extend to multimodal later. Okay? Any other questions? All right. So this was this. So we also observed an interesting effect that while we were stimulating in one brain region, the response was actually distributed across a network of regions, but the strength of the response was variable. So the question was why, and we hypothesized this has something to do with at-rest functional network connectivity. So to test this hypothesis, we actually computed a network controllability measure that essentially tells you how much energy you need at a source node to modulate the LFB activity at each of the target nodes. And this was done on data before any stimulation. And what we found was that indeed this explained the variability during stimulation, meaning that the more strongly functionally you were connected prior to stimulation to the stimulation side, the more strongly you responded. So this was a nice validation of this input-output modeling framework. All right. So I showed you the effect of input, but what you may have noticed, I avoided talking about behavior, and this was indeed agnostic to behavior. So can we bring behavior back? And as well as input. Can we include input, which could be feedback, sensory feedback, or any kind of feedback, into this joint neural behavioral dynamical modeling? So let's first depict the formulation here. So remember, we have a set of behaviorally relevant states. We have a set of other states. They give rise to behavior and to neural activity. So now the question is how the dynamics of these states are generated. In particular, there are two sources for these dynamics. The first source is intrinsic dynamics, which is due to the functional connectivity in the neuronal population. But there's potentially another source, which is the dynamics associated with dynamically structured inputs that may also appear in the dynamics of these states. So if you look at this in the frequency domain, the intrinsic dynamics correspond to the transfer function of this input-output box. The inputs have some structure and spectrum. They convolve, and they give you the neural spectrum. So if you look at the neural spectrum, there's a peak in it that corresponds to the intrinsic dynamics, but there's also a peak in it that corresponds to external input that have nothing to do with it. So the question is, can we dissociate the two to better tease apart the neural computation that underlie the neural and behavioral, the behavior that we are interested in? Okay, so of course, yes?
Sorry, about that.
Yes.
Does this maybe say something about what input to a system can be?
Yes.
That you have to
We have to measure it.
Well,
This measured
like
method.
the nature of what an input source could be is something like a frequency decomposition or something.
Input can be anything as long as it's measured. So so I've shown you, for example, simulation example. I'll show you an example, a data example where I took the input as sensory input, so task instruction inputs. And I'll show you that. So it could be any, but it has to be measured. That's the constraint. So you have to partially measure it. If you have a measured input, it doesn't matter what. You just take the time series. That's it. You don't need to do any kind of frequency decomposition. Just take the time series. Okay? All right. So we have a measured input. Of course, we have to put it in the model. But the question is, again, how do we fit it? That's where all the difficulty lies, right? So what we wanted to do was to enable a new capability even fit in this model. We wanted to be able to dissociate the behaviorally relevant subtype of intrinsic dynamics, both from other intrinsic dynamics as well as external input dynamics. And we wanted to do so while prioritizing the learning of the behaviorally relevant subtype, because I'll show you that that prioritization is actually critical in identifying it accurately. Now, the key idea to solving this was to formulate a learning problem that now included neural activity, behavior, and input, and to come up with a multi-stage learning algorithm that in earlier stages prioritized the learning of the behaviorally relevant subtype of intrinsic dynamics. Now, the algorithm is a little bit involved because it's an analytical method, but it's fully shown in the preprint that I've put the information for there, so feel free to look. But what I'm going to focus on is, let's say we have this algorithm, what can we do with it, and why does it matter? Okay, so to quantify the accuracy of dynamics, we look at the eigenvalues of the state transition matrix A, because that is telling us essentially how the state moves from one time step to the next. And these eigenvalues in general are complex conjugate numbers whose angle tells us the frequency with which neural dynamics oscillate in time in response to excitation, and whose radius tells us how fast neural dynamics decay in time in response to excitation. So we can look at these eigenvalues as essentially a summary statistics of the temporal structure. So first, let's look at numerical simulations. We simulated a system that had two behaviorally relevant states or eigenvalues, two other states, and then an input that had two eigenmodes or eigenvalues. So we first fit the neural dynamical model. Again, this model doesn't take into account input nor behavior. And you can see that the eigenvalues it finds are, of course, confused both by the behaviorally irrelevant dynamics as well as input dynamics. Then we added PSID. And as you can see, PSID is not confused by the behaviorally irrelevant dynamics, but it is confused, indeed, by the input dynamics, as we just discussed. Then we added an input dynamical system modeling, where we give the input to NDM, but we don't give it behavior. Now, it doesn't get confused by input, but it gets confused with the other neural dynamics. And the only method that finds these green eigenvalues or eigenmodes of behaviorally relevant states is this new method that takes all of these signal sources appropriately into account. So this is just a toy example to give some intuition, but we also extensively quantify the performance of these methods in identifying these behaviorally relevant modes or dynamics as a function of training data samples. So here's this new method. And here's a neurodynamical model that takes input into account. And if, in case you haven't seen this, there's various ways to fit an NDM with input. You can use expectation maximization. There's subspace-based methods that do this. So this is not difficult to do. So let's look at the performance. So you can see that at every single training sample size, this new method that takes all of the behavior, neural activity, and input into account does better in identifying the behaviorally relevant subtype than INDM. And interestingly, to get the same error as INDM, it needs orders of magnitudes fewer training samples. So you may ask me, okay, what is this? So the issue is that this unsupervised method, even though it takes into account input, has no way of dissociating or prioritizing one subtype of neural dynamics over the other, in this case, behaviorally relevant subtype. So in order to find those behaviorally relevant ones, it needs to actually fit a much higher dimensional latent state models to find those behaviorally relevant ones somewhere in its state. And because of that, it needs to fit a much more complex model that would be learned less accurately for a given number of training samples. And that's the beauty of actually prioritizing those subtypes that you're interested in. To further show the importance of this prioritized and multi-stage learning, we also formulated a numerical optimization method that actually maximizes the log likelihood of neural and behavior data given input. So this time, it has everything that we give our method, access to every signal source that our method has access to, but does it in a single stage through a likelihood optimization. And same thing happened. So you can see that this shows you the importance of this multi-stage learning for prioritizing the subtypes that you're interested in. OK, all of this was simulation. Let's go to the real data. So we looked at a public data set from the Savi's lab, where monkeys were performing this cursor movement task. Behavior here was the cursor kinematics. And input here was the sensory task instruction input about where the target actually is. So first, we looked at the eigenmodes of this new method and the other methods. They're distinct. And then the eigenmodes found by the new method is actually better in description of neural and behavioral data, showing consistent with our simulation that it better identified those intrinsic dynamics. But this is one data set. One good capability that we are providing here is that you can actually take into account differences in inputs and sensory input across different tasks. So this gives you the capability to actually go ahead and compare neural dynamics across distinct tasks. So we said, OK, let's do that. So we took another public data set, this time, completely independent, from the Miller lab, in which the monkey this time was moving a cursor randomly using a manipulandum. And we wanted to look at the neural dynamics across these three monkeys, two different tasks. So first, we fit an unsupervised neural dynamic model that did take into account input. And you can see that the dynamics that we find, these are overall intrinsic dynamics. The dynamics we find are different across animals and across tasks, which kind of makes sense. The input is different, they're doing different things, maybe they have different internal states. But then we said, OK, so let's now focus and zoom in onto the behaviorally relevant subtype of intrinsic dynamics using our method. And you can see that the dynamics are remarkably similar across animals, across tasks, unlike the overall intrinsic dynamics. So this shows you that by taking into account not only behavior but input, we can actually have a tool to interpret common fundamental neural computation that might underlie a generality of tasks in different animals and make interpretations that may otherwise not be possible. All right. So that's input. We added that. But everything so far that we've talked about has relied on a linear dynamical system model, which is, of course, a great model. It's interpretable, fast, efficient. It's very useful. But we know from a lot of beautiful work on unsupervised modeling of neural data that nonlinearity can actually be quite important in building models of neural activity patterns. Moreover, if you want, yes?
Before you move on to nonlinearity,
Yes.
can I ask one question?
Sure.
About temporal dynamics?
Yes.
You had these equations previously where you also had matrices that directly couple input into behavior and input into neural signals. And there was no particular temporal dynamics there. Can I interpret those as respectively stimulation artifacts and sort of reflexive behaviors that avoid the brain, or what do those couplings mean?
Yeah, those are feed-forward terms, as you mentioned, right? So they're not dynamical terms. So the dynamics go through the first line. So this, if I had an input there, the A, as you go forward, right, the A operates on the U as well. So the dynamics come from here. If I add the input here and here, that's just the feed-forward. So sometimes when you discretize systems in time, you need that feed-forward time for accuracy, but you could also eliminate that potentially if you keep the temporal resolution fine enough. But those are not dynamical terms. Those are just feed-forward terms.
And one related question. Often, of course, behavior comes later than the neural signals, or there's a temporal dynamics there. Is that captured by the temporal dynamics of the latent brain state and the terms that we're perhaps not seeing coupled to the signals?
Yeah, so it is possible that by learning kind of the forgetting factor associated with this A matrix, and in particular the Kalman gain, that so once you write down this state space model in predictor form, you have this Kalman equation. You can look at this forgetting factor of that, interpret the delays and so on. So it's possible that it would learn it automatically, but if you actually know what the temporal delays are, you may actually just shift this also. So that might be easier. If you have some prior knowledge about it, then you can just enforce it, not rely on the model to figure it out. But if you don't, it could to some extent learn that as well. Any other questions before we move on to nonlinearity? Yes.
I'm not sure if I misunderstood something. So you disentangle the behavior-related and non-behavior-related neural signals with like a projection or something. Like so, do you include like for example, if the behavior is like time shift of the neural signal, like a time delay, for example, like a sin x and cos x, explain. So, but if you do a projection that way, do you also consider the time shift or time delay?
Yeah, so I think that's relevant to the question that I just asked. So if you think about the projection and if you look at the details, and I'll show you in the afternoon, this is not projection at the same time. This is projection over a time, from a time series to another time series, so from the future onto the past. So that's why, to some extent, you can learn these effects of delay. We're not just projecting this time into this time, we're projecting future into the past. So you can potentially learn those as you have enough samples. But if you have a priori knowledge about the delays, you can actually enforce it by just shifting like the behavior or neural signal with respect to each other. So it could be more accurate that way. Okay? All right, great. Okay, so let's move on to nonlinearity. So as I mentioned, nonlinearity could be important. Further, everything I've talked about so far has continuous behavior signal, which is great for motor neuroscience because we have movements, things are continuous. But in a lot of applications, for example, in cognitive neuroscience, behavior may not be continuous. They may actually be categorical, like decision choices. And unfortunately, despite its power, this linear dynamical system model does not extend to any of this. So we cannot use it. So we wanted to therefore develop a nonlinear dynamical model of neural behavioral data that allows for these capabilities so that we can go from a linear instantiation to nonlinear neural behavioral dynamical models. So how did we do this? We had to go back to the drawing board and write this relationship from neural activity to behavior in terms of 4 interpretable mappings: the mapping from neural activity to a latent state, the dynamics of the state, and then the mapping back to behavior and to neural activity. Now, within a linear dynamical system model, all of these 4 mappings are linear mappings, but we wanted to allow these to become nonlinear. And further, we didn't want to just fit some nonlinear model. We wanted to actually afford some level of interpretability in the sense of where the nonlinearities can be summarized across these 4 mappings. So we made each of these mappings linear or nonlinear. We wanted to allow that capability to make them linear or nonlinear independently of each other. We also wanted to, as I alluded to, allow for categorical behaviors, and finally for behaviors that are intermittently available, let's say self-reports or mood self-reports that you may be interested in when you're talking about effective neuroscience. So to allow all of these flexibilities, and we wanted to also extend to naturalistic setups where we don't have trial structures, we have to come up with a new learning algorithm that addresses these flexibilities. So this was the backbone of the algorithm. So the backbone was a recurrent neural network model whose inputs were neural activity and whose outputs were predicted neural activity and behavior, and whose parameters each corresponded to one of these mappings. If you look at it, I've indicated it with the parameter notations. Now, to make each of these mappings linear or nonlinear, we allowed for each of them to either be a matrix multiplication, which is linear, or a feed-forward neural network to give us a nonlinear mapping. So this is the backbone. But again, the difficult part is the learning part, the learning step. How do we learn this model jointly with neural behavioral data in a manner that dissociates behaviorally relevant dynamics? To allow this dissociation, we came up with a 4-step optimization algorithm. In the first 2 steps, we'll learn the behaviorally relevant latent states and their mapping to neural and behavioral data by essentially optimizing the prediction of behavior. And then in the last 2 steps, we find the other latent states by optimizing prediction of neural activity. And again, in the afternoon session, I'll go into the details of these optimization. So doing this, I'll show you that we actually allow for nonlinearity. We can change this cost to categorical cost, as I'll show you, to allow for categorical behaviors, and also by masking, we can allow for intermittent behaviors. So how does this work? We tested this method across 4 independent data sets. So the first was the reach and grasp that I've shown you over and over again from Bijan Pesran's lab. The second one was a saccadic eye movement task, where monkeys were saccading to 1 of 8 directions while we were recording neural activity. And the third and the fourth one were public data sets that I've talked about already, the cursor movement task from the Miller and Sabi's lab. So this gives us different brain region, different behaviors, and we also looked at different neural modalities, spiking, raw LFP, and LFP power features. So there were 4 use cases that we wanted to establish. The first use case is nonlinear modeling of neural behavioral data. So first, we wanted to look at this. To look at the benefit of nonlinearity here, in extracting behaviorally relevant dynamics, we looked at the decoding of behavior in each modality compared to PSID, which is a linear model that is very good at decoding behavior. And you can see that the nonlinear method actually did better, not only for spike, but also for the other LFP modalities, implying that there indeed exists nonlinearity in the transformation from neural activity to behavior. This also allowed us to compare the degree of nonlinearity across these different modalities. And what we found interestingly was that raw LFP was the modality that benefited the most from nonlinearity. And interestingly, once we did this automatic nonlinear modeling on raw LFP, it was more predictive of behavior than even the traditional LFP power band features that we typically work with, showing you that extracting these power features could lose behavior information that you can recover through this nonlinear modeling automatically. And finally, in some cases, these raw LFPs did even better than spiking activity, which was pretty cool. So this shows you, yes, we can better, using this nonlinear model, extract the behaviorally relevant subtype. But what about the other neural dynamics? At the end of the day, this is a neural behavioral data model. So we looked at the scatter plot of behavior decoding versus neural self-prediction of this method, the nonlinear neural behavioral model versus linear PSID and unsupervised nonlinear RNNs. And you can see that models that are on the top right corner are on the performance frontier because they're both better in decoding and better or as good in neural prediction. And this method was on the performance frontier in all of the data sets that we had, thus establishing this use case. Yes?
Just a clarification, the CC correlation coefficient?
Yes.
In the previous slide?
Yes.
Okay, and what's the intuition behind why raw LFP has better decoding than the power bands?
Oh, so power bands is a particular pre-specified nonlinear transform, right? You compute powers, actually like get rid of phase information, for example. So there is no guarantee that's the optimal in terms of maintaining information. So the power features are losing some behavioral relevant information. But the nonlinear modeling that works on the raw LFP can automatically summarize more information. That's the intuition. Because the power features are specific nonlinear transform, right? That don't even look at phase information, for example, right? So there is no optimality guarantee for it. It's just traditionally they're used because they relate to brain oscillations and so on. I use them too. But this shows you that that actually is losing some information that we can recover through a nonlinear, direct nonlinear automatic transfer. Okay, does that make sense?
What about if you decompose the raw LFP into phase information as well and incorporate that?
Yes, I haven't done that, but then the question is how you transform. Like, what do you compute? Like, what is that transform, right? So there is no transform that I know of, traditional transforms. So the question then becomes, what feature do we extract? So what this is arguing for is that we don't have to a priori impose a particular transform. We can just let the data speak, build a dynamical model, and that would automatically extract features that are most informative. So that's the whole idea, to get rid of that essentially a priori assumption on the features. Yes?
I can't intuit this, but if you let the data speak and you can kind of build these things, can it inform you of what the optimal kind of decomposition could be to inform subsequent research going forward?
Yes,
Trials or
yes.
whatever?
It is very possible. So, we haven't looked at the details of, okay, are these features interpretable, for example, right? Or is it just like essentially you get an automatic RNN-based transform? But that's a very good question. It may be possible that when you look deeper into the transform that this RNN performs, you can find interpretable ones. But we haven't done that. That is a great point. Yes? Yes?
There's a question about the ability to compare LFP recordings and spikes. In principle, you can record from many more independent sites simultaneously in the same brain with LFP electrodes than you can with if you're doing spikes.
Correct.
And so is it possible that that was the case and the better performance on the LFP data is because you were gathering data from more different brain regions than you could with the spiking data? And in general, how does the performance relate to which brain areas are recorded and how many brain areas are recorded rather than the specific modality of spikes versus
Yeah, so fantastic question, multiple sections to that. First, in this case, it's not possible because the same electrodes are used. These are actually intracortical electrodes that we get both LFP and spike exactly from. So in this case, it's not possible. But in general, indeed, it is possible. And that's why I am a fan of LFP. I think that for decoding some brain states, like emotions, for example, that we know are distributed, we probably don't need that high resolution in a given region, but rather the distribution across regions. And these local field potentials can be quite powerful. So indeed, it is possible to get benefit from LFP because it's easier to distribute it across the brain rather than focus focusing on one region. But in this case, that's not the case. All right. OK. Where were we? All right, so the second use case is nonlinear dimensionality reduction. So because this is a behavior-informed modeling, we hypothesize that it can actually summarize behavior information using much lower state dimensions. And that was the case when we compared with the nonlinear RNN. The third use case is to localize the source of model nonlinearity to afford some level of interpretability. In particular, the question here is where can I summarize the nonlinearity across these 4 mappings? And this can provide some ability for hypothesis testing to again interpret neural computations. So there are 2 properties this method has that make it suitable for this sort of hypothesis testing about the source of nonlinearity. The first property it has is that it allows you to compare one source of nonlinearity, not just with a linear model, which is not sufficient, but also with alternative sources of nonlinearity so that you can rule out incorrect nonlinear sources. Further, the second property is that you can actually compare different sources, not just in terms of decoding of behavior or prediction of neural activity, but overall in terms of both behavior decoding and neural prediction. Because in some cases, 2 models may be indistinguishable in one performance criteria, but you can distinguish them when you look at both. So with this justification, we said, OK, let's first confirm this in numerical simulation. So we simulated data from models where we knew where the nonlinearity is. So for example, here in the neural input or K parameters. And you can see that the method correctly finds it by putting it on the top right performance frontier, saying this is the best one. So it found it correctly. And this shows you why the first property is important, because had we just compared with a linear model, a behavior readout is also better than a linear model. But the nonlinearity is not there. The only reason we can do this is this hypothesis testing capability. We also found that other parameters, when they were nonlinear, we could correctly find them. For example, the neural readout being nonlinear. This is why the second property is important. These models are indistinguishable in behavior decoding, but distinguishable in neural prediction. And similarly for the recursion when it was nonlinear and the behavior readout. So having confirmed this in simulation, we went to our real data. And we did the hypothesis testing, first on this reach and grasp data set. So what we found interestingly was that summarizing the nonlinearities just in the readout from the latent dynamics to behavior was largely sufficient to describe the neural behavioral data well, meaning it was as good as a fully nonlinear model and better than every individual nonlinearity. So this is interesting. What about the other data set? So we looked at all of these movement-related data sets, and in all of them, the same result held, meaning summarizing the nonlinearity there was largely sufficient. So this shows you an example of why this modeling affords some level of interpretability. So for example, I can now hypothesize that the nonlinearity being in the output of motor cortical area may be, for example, consistent with cognition intervening between the brain state and behavior, for example, context-dependent computations. Or it could be consistent with downstream nonlinear processing in the spinal cord. So I can form a testable hypothesis, I can expand my recording regions, refit the model, revise my hypothesis, and narrow down the source. So this is essentially a tool for hypothesis testing. And finally, and I'll delve into more detail in the method lecture, we showed the generalization across categorical behaviors, here task epochs, and again, the similar results held. All right. So we made things nonlinear in a level and afforded some level of interpretability. Now, I've so far talked about a single modality of neural activity at a time, either spike or LFP. What about having multiple modalities simultaneously? What if I have both spikes and LFPs? Can I extend this dynamical model to become multi-scale? And this is important because we know that behavior and mental states are actually represented across distinct spatial temporal scales, from spikes to LFP to ECOG to EEG. But our dynamical models so far, including what I've shown you, focus usually on one scale. So can we go multi-scale? This is a problem that we've been working on for a while. And to go multi-scale, of course, requires us to take into account the different statistical profiles and timescales of these different modalities. For example, spikes are these binary action potential events happening at a millisecond timescale, while field potentials may be continuous and slowly varying. So we've been developing multi-scale dynamical model that can tell us how a given latent state not only is represented in continuous modalities, but also in discrete modalities that we model as a point process or Poisson process that you probably have heard about in the past week. Now, this is a new model structure. It's a multi-scale dynamical model. So we had to develop new learning algorithms to learn the parameters. We had to develop new inference or decoding algorithms to aggregate information across modalities about the latent state, and that allowed us to go multi-scale with our dynamical models. I'm not going to go into the details of the algorithms. These are published. This is a multi-scale decoder. You can think of it as a generalization of Kalman filters that aggregates information. Then we also have a multi-scale expectation maximization. You've seen expectation maximization. We extended it to multi-scale so that we can iteratively find the model parameters. You can look at the papers. But what I'm going to focus on is what can we do with this for neuroscience. So in a recent paper, we used this model to explore multi-scale dynamics underlying this naturalistic reach and grasp movements. In particular, we wanted to look at the spike LFB dynamics in combination and compare them. So again, as I talked about, once we fit this model to look at dynamics, we can just look at the eigenvalues and compare them. So we did so for models just for LFB, models just for spike, and models for the combination with our multi-scale model. So when you look here, you'll see that there are, of course, eigenvalues and modes in spike and LFB that are distinct, as you would expect. But there appears to be one mode, meaning that is at a very similar location, meaning it has the same frequency and time decay characteristic. And interestingly, that same mode showed up when we built a model in combination for the multi-scale data. So what this implies is that there exists shared multi-scale dynamics across the brain that play a role in the performance of this naturalistic movement. And indeed, when we looked at the decoding, this mode was dominantly predictive of movement, showing its importance. And then because this mode existed, we could aggregate information across fields and spikes to do better decoding of movement, which has important implications, of course, for brain-machine interfaces. All right, so we're almost there. One other element that I want to show you how we can add is to incorporate geometry and structure into the dynamical model. In particular, there are manifolds that underlie these neural dynamics. Can we take the shape of that manifold into account while building a dynamical model? So why is this important? Where did this intuition come from? So when we looked at the literature across different neural systems, one feature that always appears when people do dimensionality reduction, and it doesn't matter what method they use, linear, nonlinear, are these rotations. They show up in the olfactory system, in the motor system, in a head direction system, in a lot of systems. So the question is why? Why are these rotations showing up all over the place? Our hypothesis was that perhaps this implies that the manifold underlying these neural dynamics is not just a linear hyperplane, but the specific nonlinear manifolds that contain holes or loops. For example, this band or this torus. And that is why when you project the activity onto hyperplane, you have these rotations naturally showing up. So the question was, can we incorporate this kind of manifold geometry explicitly when we build a dynamic model? For example, tear out latent states, you have to be moving on a manifold that looks like this. So this is actually mathematically very, very difficult. We've been working on it for the past 5 years in the lab, and now we have a method that actually is working, and we're very excited about it. I'll give you some intuition about this because it's not published. We've presented it at conferences before. So the idea is, let's say this is your real true trajectory. It's moving around a manifold that is loopy, and you have some noisy data from that. So what we do is first, we confirm our hypothesis by applying topological data analysis standard tool to see first, is there a loop or a hole in the data? If we confirm that, then we have to fit the shape of this loop. We call this the main manifold structure or loop in this case. But that is not enough because, of course, we want to capture more complexity around this loop. So what we did was we derived local coordinate systems around this loop that allow us to make this manifold multidimensional. For example, from a 1D loop to a 2-dimensional band. And then on top of that, we run a learning algorithm that fits the dynamics on top of this shape, on top of this manifold. And you can see that the reconstructed trajectory matches the original one, showing the success of the method in these simulations. We've applied this, again, to this naturalistic reach and grasp data sets. And what we found was that, indeed, the method finds a loopy band geometry in neural data on the right. And interestingly, the movement of the neural trajectory on this band neural manifold matches the movement of the arm in the physical space. So by looking at where you are along the loop and where you are along the appending dimension, you know where the arm is in a very interpretable and nice manner. So we think this has a lot of potential for neuroscience investigations, and we're very interested and excited about it. OK, so I've shown you the elements that we can build on top of a dynamical system model. I added behavior, input, I made things nonlinear, I showed you multimodalities and multi-scale extensions, and finally geometry. Now before I end, I want to talk about going beyond correlational validation, which is what we focused on so far, towards causal validations. In particular, of course, these models already have a lot of application on offline analysis. But can we actually also causally validate them by applying a closed-loop perturbation, using the model to predict its effect on neurobehavioral data causally, and then use that as a validation approach? How can we build these closed-loop perturbation systems that are model-based? So idea here would be that you will build a closed-loop system that takes the neural activity, from that estimates the state, and then uses that as feedback within a feedback controller to adjust the perturbation, for example, stimulation, and take the brain states towards a target level. Now, there are multiple challenges we have to overcome to build this system. This model-based system does not exist today. The first challenge is to build a dynamical encoding model, what we've been talking about throughout this talk, and there's a lot of beautiful work also in the literature on this. But in this case, that won't be enough, because even if you can decode and encode perfectly, you still don't know the effect of perturbation. So that's where the input-output modeling paradigms that we talked about come in, to predict the effect of input on output and on the brain state. And finally, we have to combine them within a control strategy. So I'll give you some intuition of this third step, now that you've seen the modeling frameworks. So the idea here is that if you have an input-output model, you know how changing the stimulation changes neural activity. Now, if you have a decoder, you know how that activity changes behavior. So together, these models can tell you the effect of input on behavior through neural activity and allow you to build a feedback controller of behavior. So then you can run your feedback controller in real time, predict the effect of stimulation or perturbation, look at it. Do they match? If they match, you've causally validated your model. Now, this closed-loop system, of course, also has neurotechnology implications. For example, for brain-machine interfaces for neuropsychiatric disorders. The only difference here is that the state that we decode is a mental state, like mood in depression or pain in chronic pain. And then the target is a healthy target specified by a clinician. Indeed, we've already shown that decoding of these mental states is possible using this dynamical system modeling framework. So here is some data we collected in epilepsy patients across multiple brain regions, while patients were actually reporting their mood using questionnaires. And this was in collaboration with Eddie Chang, who collected the data sets. And then the question was, how do we fit the decoder using this high-dimensional neural feature space and sparse mood samples that are intermittently up there? So the mood is now our behavioral measure, which is very sparse. So indeed, the dynamical system model allowed us to do this. We showed back in 2018 that by fitting a dynamical system model and doing a region selection, finding predictive subnetworks, we can decode mood variations from human intracranial brain activity in a personalized manner, thus opening the door to personalized tracking of these symptom states. We also found that the decoder finds mood predictive brain regions to provide scientific insight. In particular, showing that orbitofrontal cortex was the most mood predictive. And then when we stimulated their mood actually was alleviated, providing also a causal link of the findings of these latent state models. So you can see that these models are actually giving us interpretable and causally validated findings as well. And recently, we also extended this to decoding of chronic pain. And again, the dynamical system modeling allowed us to decode high and low pain levels in patients who were implanted with a chronic device. Now, the next step, of course, so far we just get the feedback signal. The next step is to actually build the system. This hasn't been built yet. So we started a clinical trial at USC in collaboration with the neurosurgery department just very recently to actually build the system, to actually move towards regulating these states and also combining them with physiological measures. So that's kind of the overview of dynamical system models, how they're useful for basic science and for brain-machine interfaces and neurotechnologies. I want to, of course, thank the students in the lab first and foremost. This is all their work. 2 of them are here. You'll hear from them in the tutorial section, as well as the funding sources. And thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to our discussions. Yes?
Is there, I think you probably said this, and I probably didn't latch onto it.
Yes.
I
I don't blame you, yeah.
I don't like, yeah.
There's a lot of information here.
Once you understand and can describe a nonlinear system, are there ways to, knowing that target, decompose the system into a linear system? I'm thinking of if you have a non-Markovian description of a task or something, some event unfolding, often with like a little extra juice in the system, you can decompose that into something that is Markovian. You just didn't really have it all in your non-Markovian description of that. I'm wondering if there's something similar here that could lend itself to back to linear methods once you have an understanding of the nonlinear type of things.
So the method that usually people use is locally linearizing things, right, around an operating point. Like that's what, for example, switching linear dynamical systems do. So they're within an operating range, they assume it's linear, then you go to another, you switch to another linear system. There's also adaptive methods that try to do this. I didn't talk about them. We work on some of those. So like you adapt the parameters of your linear dynamics. So you're kind of approximating a nonlinear function with locally linear parts, right? So that's the extent that I can think of approximating a nonlinear system with locally linear dynamics. I think this is also used in a lot of deep learning frameworks to interpret dynamics, like basically linearizing around operating points. So I think that could be possible. Yes.
And like at a fundamental level, is the brain nonlinear, or do we just have a nonlinear approximation that is in fact kind of linear once you have the whole scope of the problem?
Yeah. So that's $1 million question, right? But I think the question, that's a great question, but what we can do to make it more precise is that is the brain nonlinear at a given scale, right? So of course there's nonlinear processes at the small scale, like single neurons. But then when you look at aggregate activity like LFB or ECOG, perhaps those nonlinearities are reduced through the averaging effect, right? Through central limit theorem and all that. So I think the question is, first of all, what is the target? So what's the input-output? And we have to define nonlinearity or linearity in that context. For example, for behavior, I showed you that we needed the nonlinearity. But for neural activity, we didn't need it. So the question also is, what is the output? What is the precise question that we are asking? And what's the scale at which we're asking it? But I think fundamentally, these are useful models. There is some nonlinear effects that can be approximated. And it all depends what the question and application is. Any other questions? Oh, yes.
A conceptual and a technical question.
Yes.
Conceptually, you showed that for the nonlinear system to add to the predictive power of your model, you really needed it in the output stage toward the behavior, and you didn't particularly need it within the brain state. Could it be that the fact that there is temporal dynamics implemented in the brain state, but not in any of the other paths, mean that this temporal dynamics somehow already encapsulates the power that your nonlinear system allows now elsewhere?
I don't believe so, because the temporal dynamics are kept linear, right? So, and then for behavior, we needed that nonlinear readout, but for neural activity, we didn't, right? So there is a distinction between behavior and neural activity there, even though they both use the same underlying state, right? The dynamics are the same. They give rise to both of them. For behavior, I needed nonlinearity. For neural activity, I didn't. And I want to preface this. I'm not saying the brain dynamics are linear, okay? So that is absolutely not the claim. In this movement-related data sets, so first of all, I want to basically say that this was movement-related, all of them. With a high enough latent state dimension, I could describe the dynamics as linear, for neural dynamics, but I still needed a nonlinearity for behavior readout. So the nonlinear processing is happening somewhere. Is it in a cognitive region? Is it downstream in the spinal cord? So this doesn't mean that the nonlinearity in dynamics doesn't exist anywhere. It just means that in my data set, it wasn't there. So I'm proposing this as a hypothesis testing tool, that we can form testable hypothesis, then, for example, go and record from prefrontal cortex and refit this model. Perhaps A will become nonlinear. Maybe cognitive processes include these more nonlinear dynamics. So this is essentially a hypothesis testing tool. It doesn't say the brain generally is like dynamics are linear. It just means in this data set, they were describable well with the linear dynamics. And then even then, for behavior, you needed nonlinearity.
Technical question, unless somebody else wants to jump in.
Yes.
In general, my intuition is that as soon as you allow nonlinearities in your model, your parameter space explodes. But in the beginning, you emphasized how you actually needed fewer parameter dimensions and fewer training samples. Where's the magic?
Yeah. So what I talked about is the state dimension. So the latent state dimension, not the parameters. And I agree that a lot of deep learning methods have a lot of parameters. Actually, our nonlinear models don't have that many parameters. But regardless, I'm not talking about the parameters. I'm talking about the state dimension that summarizes the dynamics. That is low. I'm not talking about the number of parameters are lower than a linear model, but rather, can you summarize it in a fewer state dimension, dynamic state dimension that is distinct than the number of parameters? But I agree with you, nonlinear models generally have more parameters. In our case, we don't have that, like we don't have large like language models or anything like that, so that's not like billions of parameters. But again, this is about the representation dimension, not the number of parameters. Yes? Yeah.
Probably going well beyond what you have data for at this point, but we're not going to always have invasive
Yes.
scalp or a cortical EEG measures and this kind of stuff. Do you have a sense of how, like, if you have that information to define an internal model of what the trajectory is of that nonlinear state space potentially within the individual, and you have external measures like skin conductive, like whatever
Yes.
is actually available, like your smartwatch or
Yes.
whatever. Do you have a sense of how generalizable that internal data source model is to better inform the mood predictions that would be applied to somebody else, where you do just have the external measures? That
Yeah.
is, like, can that form the kernel of
Yes.
something that is generalizable?
Yes.
We don't
Yes.
need
Yes.
neural recordings from every individual.
Yes.
That's what it applied to.
So I think even a simple question is, even within that individual, does it generalize to non-invasive? Forget even another individual. Even that is not known. So this is a great question. That's what we're interested in looking at, right? So we just started this clinical trial where we are interested in looking at physiological markers as well as invasive markers and the relationship. Now with EEG, to my knowledge, it hasn't been possible to decode emotions in a given person over time. You have been able to do classification across populations, so on, but not decoding. And this has not been tried. The question is, Are these biomarkers we find with intracranial EEG, does that extend to EEG? And then does it have also correlates in the physiological markers? These are all great unknown questions that we need to address. But one promising finding that we had was that orbitofrontal cortex was the most smooth predictive, and that's close to the surface. So perhaps we can get it in EEG. Yes, exactly. So that provides some, hopefully, indication that it may be possible with non-invasive, but we don't know. Yes. Yes.
For the end of the slides, you talk about the geometry structure of the
Yes.
thing. So, for the topological geometry of the hidden space or no space, it could be a band or torus. So, why we cannot decide it? Is that because of like technologic issue? I mean, because we cannot marry all the data points, or there will be always a high variance or noise in the experiments? Is that why you cannot decide the technological structure of the?
Okay. So you mean, is it easy to find a geometric structure?
Yeah.
So actually, TDA that I showed you, this is an existing method. But what it does, it just tells you, oh, your data has a one-dimensional loop, or it has a two-dimensional hole. That's all it tells you. It doesn't give you a model, it doesn't fit it, it doesn't give you a manifold, it doesn't grow the dimensionality. It doesn't even give you a multidimensional manifold model, let alone a dynamical model. So TDA is a tool that actually can count the number of holes in data, but it does not allow you to model the manifold nor the dynamics on top of it. So the challenge we were dealing with was, okay, once we confirm with TDA there exists a hole, how do we model it? How do we fit dynamics on top of it? So that was the difficulty. But in general, even for TDA, in noisy data, it's very difficult to detect manifolds, right? So this is, in general, a challenging problem.
We'll take a 10-minute break and we'll come back.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys.